Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our Ask an Expert webinar today on the topic of Proficy Suite Cybersecurity by Design. Before we hop into the topic, just a quick disclaimer and confidentiality notice. And some housekeeping items. So if you have any questions for our our presenters today, please enter them on the Q&A button, and we will answer them in the end. If you have any technical issues and you need to contact our team, you can do that with the hands button. You will also see on your navigating tool. You can also access additional resources relevant to our webinar today with the hyperlink button you have on your tool. If you need to contact our speakers, you can also do that with the number 4 button on the screen. If you need any technical assistance, you can do so with the question mark button. And then finally, we have a quick survey in the end, just so that we know if you have any further questions for our presenters, they can reach out to you accordingly. Before diving into the topic, I wanted to quickly remind all of you that this is a monthly webinar series, and we have topics that resonate with our audience every month. So we have the March episode today, and if you were interested to sign up for some of our upcoming episodes, you can do that by just scanning the QR code on the screen. We also have the link to all of the episodes on the navigation tool. So if you wanted to just click on the link from there and register that way, you're also welcome to do that. And with that, I just wanted to introduce our speakers. So we have Brandon Bailey, the Principal Product Security Leader at GE Vernova. And then we have Cassio Silva, who's a Senior Business Consultant at Velotic, which is where Proficy is now a part of. And Cassio will cover a little bit more about what it means for Proficy to be part of Velotic moving forward. So with that, I'll pass it to Cassio.
Thanks, Aroni. Hi, everyone. So let's start by talking a little bit about Velotic, our new company. And as many of you already know, TPG has acquired GE Vernova's Proficy manufacturing software business. And we are very excited to have reached this agreement, since this is going to position Proficy for, let's say, a long-term independent success as part of a focused pure play software company. And TPG brings deep experience in scaling innovative software business. So this kind of expertise gives us some strong confidence in the future of this portfolio. So what you see here is, let's say, it's a combination of Proficy, Capware, and ThingWorx, bringing together proven technologies into a single integrated platform focused on industrial operations. So together, we will be able to create an even more powerful foundation to help our customers drive smarter and more optimized outcomes. So next. So here is just a high-level overview of our Proficy portfolio. We can see how the Proficy portfolio supports the full journey from the plant floor to the cloud across the enterprise. And starting on production scheduling, right? We have this solution to help planners create and maintain more dynamic and effective production schedulers based on available resources. When we say resources, we are referring to machines, to people, materials, right? Moving to production automation, our HMI SCADA solutions provide real-time visibility and control over plant operations. We also have industrial data management, right? This is responsible for capturing and organizing critical production data and to create a strong foundation for insight and decision making. Let's say data is the pillar. It's all about data when we start talking about digital transformation, right? And then we have manufacturing execution systems. This kind of system is responsible for connecting and managing operations on the shop floor to improve efficiency, quality, traceability. And finally, we have production optimization. This is responsible for leveraging advanced analytics and AI to improve performance and drive smarter outcomes. So together, all of these capabilities form an integrated portfolio that connects every layer of manufacturing production, this is about enabling better visibility, control, and optimization across the entire enterprise. So let's take a quick look at today's agenda. First, we will cover our cybersecurity organization, how we are structured, and how we approach security across the business. Next, we will walk through our secure development lifecycle, outlining how security is embedded into our products from the ground up. We will also cover our defense and depth approach, how we embed security by design across the platform, how we use layered protections, and how we minimize attack surfaces. Right? And after that, we will touch on the NIS2 initiative, which focus on our collaboration with customers, alignment between cyber and engineering, and bringing best practice for secure development and deployment. From there, we will bring it all together by looking at how we are securing the Proficy portfolio specifically. And finally, we have some time at the end for any questions. Okay. So that said, I will now hand over to my colleague, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you, Cassio, for that background. I think I want to start with what is product security. And ultimately, it breaks down, and product security ensures that customers, which is ultimately the audience of this call, can trust products. And we do that by embedding security into the architecture, development, and ongoing operations. So it's a very different, organizational skill set than your traditional cyber. So just keep that in focus when we talk about like what my role is here, and then the things that we're doing to make that possible. So we're going to go briefly over the organization structure. And here what we have is we like our pillars. So we have our planning pillar, which is that very early secure by design. So we're embedded in the design phase and the architectural decisions that are being made to ensure that when we go into the operational phase, we know that the architecture is secured, and then we have a tiered approach of how we can monitor that environment. My core focus is on the product. So that is the actual development of the product, making sure that from the source code to the deployment is in fact secure. We handle the incidents. So my team also operates our PSIRT, the Product Security Incident Response Team. We work with the teams, whether we find a vulnerability or a customer reports to us a vulnerability or a researcher reports to us a vulnerability, the defect management of that. So the entire life cycle of reporting through resolution and communication to customers of those findings. And we also run an internal red team that does regular penetration tests against our own products. And then, of course, that loops back into the defect management process. And then on the engineering side, we embed with engineering to ensure that security is taken into account, even as it's being developed, but also new features and new releases. So from the beginning stages of the architectural designs all the way to feature development and future releases as they continue to build, as well as securing, monitoring, and overall ensuring the hardening of the actual hosted environments themselves. And then the other underlaying of that is our risk and compliance team that ensures through the entire life cycle we're meeting our objectives when it comes to the different compliance frameworks and audit frameworks that we are entrusted to uphold. And so we're going to talk about why cybersecurity, and hopefully everybody on this call understands the importance. But again, going back to those pillars, we secure not only the infrastructure of the on-prem and cloud offerings, but the underlying software itself. So very much a defense in depth approach. If the software itself is not secure, all it takes is one layer of compromise to lead to multiple cascading effects. So we really focus on the entire life cycle of the product. And here's just some of the top challenges facing customers. And in the context of these products, it's really targeted malware, workforce challenges, regulatory pressure, cyber war comes into play with nation states going at each other. Branded bugs, more of, again, kind of tying into that nation state actor of these really high profile vulnerabilities and exploits that kind of happen. And in today's day and age, supply chain risk is probably one of the biggest topics, which kind of feeds into the NIST2 initiative we'll talk to later. But again, take this all into account. I don't want to talk too much about all of them so that we can keep things moving forward. And this data is from 2023, but ultimately the share is probably very similar today. We don't have the updated numbers, but as you can see, manufacturing software is a big share of cyber attacks. And there's probably a number of reasons for that, but I think number one, if you look at in the context of some of these others, manufacturing by default, it tends to be more publicly facing. It has a bigger exposure, bigger exposure window. And so by default, it happens to be a bigger target. So let's dig in a little bit deeper on the secure development lifecycle. So here you can see the inner piece of this is ultimately the software development lifecycle. So you have your requirements gathering, your design phase, development phase, testing phase, and deployment phase. And that is what we would consider the software development lifecycle. And then the outer ring in the darker green is kind of that secure software development lifecycle. So in the requirements phase, we not only do we embed and ensure that architectural designs and data flow diagrams are well documented and looked through from a security lens, but we also provide training at that level. So number one, the next time we have to do it, we start our baseline as higher. And from there in the design phase, that's typically where we'll do, so if you start with the data flow diagram of the idea, and you have your architectural reference diagram, then we'll do a risk assessment, even on the concept. So we'll walk through and do a threat model based on that. And again, so going into the development and the design phase, the threat models are all kind of taken into account there. And then the testing phase, this goes into development as well. So again, these are kind of ongoing at all times, but security scanning is a big important part of what we do. And number one reason is it's best to catch vulnerabilities early. So we utilize a number of different tools, so static analysis, software scanning, dynamic analysis, and then OSS, open source security, which in the industry is typically considered as software composition analysis. And that's looking at your open source components, not only from a vulnerability standpoint, but also from an intellectual property standpoint. We don't want to incorporate open source software that's licensing is too strict and therefore would put our intellectual property at risk. And so it's important to take that into account. Dynamic analysis is it's almost an automated pen test. We wouldn't consider it as in-depth as our pen test, which is why we still have them. But DAST gives you a good starting point that you can do through your continuous integration and continuous development lifecycle to catch problems earlier in the lifecycle, so that once you get to the penetration test, which is your ultimate gate before release, there should be fewer surprises. And that way those teams that are highly skilled are not overburdened with I guess we'll call it low-hanging fruit that they could have been caught earlier. And static analysis is really looking at line by line the actual source code that we develop internally and looking for any number of anti-patterns in development, looking for your OWASP top 10 type of vulnerabilities, so cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and again, pretty easy to identify through an automated means, which then brings us into the deployment phase. And prior to deployment, we have our cyber lab do an actual penetration test to detect any of the real serious vulnerabilities that we will then remediate prior to release. And so as we go into the penetration test, the inherent, I guess, setup internally to our product teams is we have a cyber research lab. And that's what we consider our red team. It's filled with researchers that not only penetration test our products, but also our supply chain in many cases. So they will look at open source components that we're relying on that could have a big business impact. And they'll do penetration tests against those products as well. And they have many research and CVEs published to their name, which really just, again, the high tide lifts all ships. So if we secure our products, but we're dependent on a dependency that isn't secure, that could ultimately lead to our compromise. And so we try to evaluate where possible the entire supply chain. And they're really good at their job. And ultimately, if you were to submit a vulnerability finding through our PCERT process, what ends up happening is my team will intake it, we'll triage it, we'll coordinate with the appropriate internal product team and engineering team, but then we will also leverage our cyber lab to verify and validate that finding. Because there are some times where it's deployment dependent and it has nothing to do with the underlying product, but then we'll all work together. And then as well, in a case where it is a true positive and the engineering and product teams attend to it, then we will have our cyber lab verify that it is fixed before we release the patch. And this is an overview of kind of going back to that security development lifecycle and why we do things at every stage. If you catch a vulnerability or a defect in this, whether it's a bug or a vulnerability, you catch it early, the cost is low. And these numbers are relative. You could put them on a dollar scale or a time scale when you think about the complexity of catching things later in the life cycle. If you catch it at the implementation time, again, so if you think about our tooling, the design phase is more of a whiteboard type of diagram drawing. And if we notice like, hey, this connection to that connection needs to be encrypted, cool, we've covered that. But if we don't catch it until it comes to the implementation where we notice, hey, you're using HTTP traffic instead of HTTPS, at that point, it takes more time and cycles to implement that fix. Testing and validation is another thing where, look, we want to catch things before the red team has to catch them. It would be a perfect world if our red team never found vulnerabilities. But at the end of the day, it's a far higher cost at catching at that point because they're in the process of releasing that software, and therefore release dates get pushed, and customers, you all are disappointed because you were expecting to release, and then we have to delay it for vulnerabilities. So the cost goes up. And of course, the worst case scenario is something does get past all of those gates. It's found in production, gets reported, and then it spins off that whole PCERT process where we have to re-engage everybody, which not only takes time in that moment, but it's also taking away time from that next version that's going to be released, right? Because they can't work on that if they have to go back and fix issues from previous releases. So ultimately, from a product security standpoint, it's much better to catch a problem earlier than later. These are just an overview of some of our certifications. So ISO 9001, 27001, 27017. And I won't keep reading because you can all do that yourselves. But I think if you have any questions about these, you can definitely reach out to the company. All right, let's look into defense in depth. So security by design principles, ultimately, we want to minimize the number of targets. So principle of least privilege, that's an ultimate core cyber concept. Separate privileges, which is ultimately, you segment out what functions in a software can be done by certain roles, which again, it kind of feeds into that principle of least privilege. And then separate domains. For different functional parts of the product, you should separate out those domains. And that's kind of going back and one of the pillars of, say, zero trust. Not to say that that's what we're going for here, but when you think about limiting the exposure of any one system or one person ability to impact multiple products. And then ultimately going back to our open source and other things, it's not exposing vulnerable components. So we separate out the program and the data. We separate trusted and untrusted zones, minimize the number of entry and exit points. It makes everybody's life much easier if there's minimal entry points. And number one, like documenting what those are so that everybody involved, to include the customer environment, knows what to monitor. And if anything's outside of that scope, they know that there's a problem. And this just goes into those different layers. So what thing happens at what given layer? So, all the way down, if we start at like the application layer, we talked about this a little bit, like the IAM, the identity and access management, and all the different mechanisms at which you can control that at the host level. And you go up through the zones, and I won't read through this for the sake of time, but ultimately hopefully you can review this and makes logical sense. And some of these physicals, right, it's more of like, you can conceptually understand how the difference would happen in a technical solution versus a physical solution. And this is another representation of that, where we enable this type of monitoring. So ultimately, we want to monitor the product at every phase to include deployment. And this is a layered approach, and it covers our basis. But number one, what we found is the ability, the speed at which we can identify a problem and find the source and root cause is insurmountable to our ability to impact and you kind of stop the bleeding when it comes to a security incident. And these are some of our customer resources on GE Vernova's publicly facing website. So I do ask you all that it's a great resource. And then also, reach out to your business points of contact if there's some more information that you want to see here. I kind of went over earlier what is product security, and I think that's an important concept to separate from enterprise cyber and product cyber. Is our customers ultimately are the business's customers. With the biggest security point that a customer of GE Vernova, Velotic for the Proficy suite is the product itself. And so product cyber is, we want to hear from the voice of the customer, and the customer in this case is not internal. It is the actual customers. What do you want to hear more of? What do you want to see more of? And what more can we provide for insights to make you feel more comfortable? We'll touch briefly on the NIS2 initiative. This is something coming out of the EU, and ultimately the objectives are to raise the overall cybersecurity baseline, harmonize security requirements, improve resilience in critical sectors, which we would find ourselves in, and then strengthen ultimately the incident reporting, supervision, and enforcement with clearer rules. And it's an interesting touch point that I think overlays really nicely timeline-wise with the EU Cyber Resiliency Act. And so, the Proficy Suite is working through the compliance with the EU's Cyber Resiliency Act, which ultimately will make us compliant with the NIS2 initiative, which raises the bar of security much higher. And the biggest thing, and to touch on the NIS2, is that vulnerability reporting requirement. And so it becomes a requirement of known vulnerabilities to be reported not only to the EU, but to customers. So that becomes a legal objective that we have to comply with. And I think it will lead to greater cyber outcomes across the board. Not only, in this case, NIS2 is more about critical infrastructure, but EU Cyber Resiliency Act is any product with a digital element. So of course that includes software. So I think it will raise the security bar across the globe. And some of our, just real quick, partnerships, common goals across cyber and engineering, right? We work across the organization, and this is one of the biggest challenges with cyber or product security is we have to lead through influence. We don't have direct agency over product or engineering. Our job is to ensure we find the problems, report the problems, and see them through. And so it really comes down to relationship building and the human element. And we obviously follow best practices for secure development and deployment. We work tightly with customer IT where possible to ensure that what we're providing meets your internal standards. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we have secure deployment guides that guide customers in their own deployments on what we've developed the product for that security layer to ensure that it meets your objectives. And now I'm going to turn you back over to Cassio to talk about the actual securing of the Proficy portfolio.
Thanks, Brandon. All right, let's talk about how we can secure the Proficy portfolio by design. I mean, what this means in practice, right? So based on what Brandon presented, you can see that cybersecurity is no longer an add-on or a kind of a final checklist item. It needs to be part of the journey from the very beginning across systems, users, data flows. The reality here is that as we increase connectivity and visibility on the plant floor, we also expand the attack surface. But the good news is that the Proficy portfolio already provides a strong foundation to support this journey. So there are powerful native capabilities that allow you to align with modern security practices without needing to, let's say, to revise, to reinvent your architecture. And that's what we will focus now. I will walk you through some of these built-in features to strengthen authentication, improve access control, and integrate with enterprise security standards in a kind of a scalable way. Okay. So what do we have here? This is a kind of a reference architecture for SCADA and HMI. environment, just to illustrate how multiple Proficy solutions can be deployed across the OT landscape. Here we have the Proficy components, the core components like the primary and secondary SCADA nodes configured in high availability architecture. We have storage on server, we have web space, client nodes, and we have configuration hub. Configuration hub plays a very important role in this architecture. What I want to emphasize here is the centralized configuration management approach as one of the key strategies in modern Proficy deployments. So with Proficy Configuration Hub, you have a single centralized place to configure and manage multiple applications across the environment. So this is about simplified administration, reducing configuration conflicts, allowing engineer teams to manage distributed systems in a much more efficient and controlled way. But of course, another critical aspect of this architecture is security. So as environments become more connected, we need to manage access in a more consistent and secure way. That's where Proficy authentication comes in. It provides a centralized approach as well to authentication across the platform instead of relying on isolated application level user management. So this creates the foundation to integrate with enterprise identity providers and apply modern security practices. So in the next slide, we'll take a deeper look on this architecture, authentication architecture, and how we can use identity providers, MFA, and role-based access control. So when you talk about Proficy authentication as the identity provider, there are essentially two possible approaches for managing users and identities. The first option is to use Proficy authentication directly as the user store, and in this case, users and groups are created and managed directly within the platform. This approach can work well for small or more isolated deployments. However, in most of enterprise environments, organizations prefer another approach. So large corporations typically already have centralized directories where all users and groups are managed. For example, Microsoft Active Directory, right? These systems already enforce corporate security policies such as password policies, account lifecycle management, So instead of duplicating users inside the platform, it's a great strategy to integrate with an existing directory infrastructure. In this model here, Proficy authentication works as a federation server. What does it mean in practice? As you can see in this diagram, the users actually reside in an external system, such as an Active Directory, right? When a user attempts to authenticate, for example, through a browser accessing Operations Hub, a web application, whatever, their request goes through Proficy authentication. And then Proficy authentication will query the configured external identity providers using standard protocols like SAML, LDAP, and then proceed with the authentication process. Okay. All right, so let me quickly show you in practice. I'm going to share my screen to our demo environment. Share that and quickly show you that. All right, for this demo, we have our configuration hub instance integrated with multiple applications, creating a truly distributed architecture, right? When I access the security module, for example, through the Proficy authentication plugin, I can see all the identity providers configured for the system. For example, in addition to the native UAA, we also have here two integrated identity providers. We have an Active Directory connected via LDAP and a key clock integrated through SAML, right? And of course, additional providers could be added to further optimize and scale this architecture. So now let's see how we can leverage kind of a scalable role-based access control model from this integration mechanism. So let me go back to our presentation and jump into the next slide. Okay, let's quickly review this. Process authentication, as I said, is a common security component across the entire Proficy portfolio, right? Whenever you install and integrate a Proficy application, it is automatically provisioned with a set of users and groups specific to that product. So let me jump into the other one, actually. What you see here on the slide on the left, we have the enterprise groups coming from the identity provider, such as administrators, operators, viewers, you know? And in the middle here, we have within Proficy authentication, these groups are actually mapped to application roles. So this is where we bridge enterprise identity with Proficy security model. And on the right, as you can see here, those roles define what users can access and perform across applications like MES, SCADA, and Historia. So instead of managing permissions individually, we assign users to groups, map those groups to roles, and control access across the enterprise, the entire environment. So this is what enables a scalable and standardized role-based control approach, right? So let me switch back to our environment here very quickly. I know that we are running out of time. And go back to our environment. So back to our demo environment. If I right-click here to our LDAP identity provider, you can see that I can select map groups. So let's say we want to grant these users here from the domain, you know, I want grant them access to operations hub applications, for example. So it's just a matter of coming here. I'm going to select IQP, let's see, user, for example, right? And let's say for this specific group, that's what we use to grant access to a user that they need to be members of these groups, right? So to have access to the operations hub. So all we need to do is select here this required group from the top drop down, choose the corresponding LDAP group here. Like for example, I want to go with this domain users, for example, and just click on the here, and that's it. We are mapping this to that specific group. You know, those users now inherit the required role and can be assigned to applications accordingly. Okay. All right. Going back to our presentation, almost done. Let me go back to this one actually. And we have now MFA, you know. So as I said, we saw how Proficy authentication can federate with enterprise identity providers, right? And one of the major advantages of this integration is the ability to enforce multi-factor authentication, or MFA, right? As shown in this diagram, the authentication process still begins the same way. You know, a user, let's say, connects to the application, for example, through a browser, accessing HMI or web-based application. The request is then handled by Proficy authentication, and at this point, the identity provider performs the credential validation, typically verifying the username and password. But instead of relying on passwords alone, the identity provider can also enforce a second authentication factor. This is where MFA comes into play. The user may receive a push notification on an authenticator application. He provides a one-time verification code or use another authentication method, like a hardware token, for example. And only after this second verification step, it's successfully completed, will the identity provider confirm the user identity and allow access to the application. So from a cybersecurity perspective, this is extremely important, right? Passwords alone are often the weakest point in authentication systems, right? And another important point here illustrated is that the MFA is enforced by the enterprise identity provider, not by the application itself. Okay. So going back to our environment again. See here, okay. All right, so let me get out of this session now. I showed you that we have a key clock identity provider configured, right? And now you can see that I have an option here to log in through that one, right? So when I click on that, I'm redirected to the key clock login page. I'm going to select enter my credentials, for example. And here, I didn't go through this step, but that's where you're gonna, how do I say, you're gonna, after enter the credentials, I will need now to set up an authenticator app. You know, something most of you are probably already familiar with, but from that point on, every time I log into any Proficy application, I will be prompted to enter the verification code generated by that app. So this approach ensures that our industrial systems align with modern enterprise cybersecurity standards, while we're still leveraging a centralized and easy to manage authentication architecture. Okay. Okay, so with that, I'll wrap up this section. Let's move on to the Q&A. Go back to our environment.
Super informative. So we unfortunately don't have time for a lot of questions because we're a bit over time. But we got a question. How will you take these initiatives globally? Either Cassio or Brandon want to answer that?
Yeah, so I can answer from a security perspective. I would say everything that we do is already global. The business, it's a global business. It's a globally selling product. So everything that we do is with that in mind. So I don't know specifically which initiatives you're speaking to, but in general, all the work that we do is globally focused. My team is global, and obviously the developers and everything that we do is taken into account with the global mindset.
All right. Any other questions? Any last minute question from anybody? You just have to put it on the Q&A, under the Q&A section. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions. So we will be sharing this recording with all of you after this call, and we will also be sharing the slide deck. If you do have any further questions for our presenters today, please mention that on the survey that we have for this webinar, and we will make sure to follow up with you accordingly after the webinar happens. And with that, I would like to thank our presenters today for a great presentation. And we hope to see you in our next webinar. So thank you.